come, Reverend Barber, if you will.
Well, this has been a momentous week for me. I spent many, many years in the United Methodist Church with people like Ted Baker and Ogle Wattenbarger, and Jack Edwards, and Bob and Thel Hamilton, and many, many others. And we got our freedom on Monday. So I'm not a United Methodist anymore. And it's a bittersweet thing. It's a bittersweet thing. I really am sorry that it became necessary, because the United Methodist Church was a soul-winning church and had soul-winning pastors that worked really hard. And it is what it is. And we accept that God moves us in new directions. So I'm now the pastor of the Pleasant Valley Community Church, and just keep us in prayer as we start a new journey together. Now, when Brother Earl, and I think he only, we have one thing in common, we both know Ralph Licklider. And of course I knew some S-linkers, but he let us know he had two S's. And rather than one S, I guess it makes you a better S-linkler, doesn't it, Earl? But anyway, he called me and asked me that I would speak on technology and the end times. And if we were to read from Matthew 24:37, it reads, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man." So if we realize that there's a pattern in the book of Genesis, maybe we should go back to Genesis and find out what life was like before the flood. Creation got off to a good start. It says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female created he them." Now, there's a lot of talk about what the image of God is. We could talk about the image of God being a mental image or moral image or rational image. And since we're talking about technology, I want to talk about the creative image. That God created man to be creative. And if you here as a Methodist quoting the Westminster Confession of Faith, maybe that's heresy, but it says our main purpose is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. We look at the idea of this conference is "Who am I?" And now I'm going to quote John Calvin. I'm really going deep off the deep end in the Institutes. But it's, he says, "I know that I'm a creature. I know that I'm a sinner. And I know that I need a redeemer." And, and God has put that, if you read Romans, the first chapter, has put that knowledge of God in every person. And so that nobody has any excuse. So if we need to find out who we are, the Bible tells us. In fact, the Bible is the one book that tells us the truth about ourselves, whether we want to hear it or not. The book of Genesis talks about two different generations. One, the generation of Cain, and one, the generation of Seth. And so let's look a little bit into these two generations. Now, Cain is the head of the generation that was appointed to destruction. We know that the flood came and all of Cain's line disappeared. Why? And we realize that the first characteristic of a generation that's devoted to destruction is violence. And we see it starting when Cain kills Abel. And we see the characteristic is violence. And then another one falls right on it. If we go to the next step, as God confronts Cain in his sin. What have you done? The voice of your brother cries out to me from the ground. So now you will be cursed from the earth, which has opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on earth. And Cain replies, my punishment is greater than I can bear. And then the next telling statement, it says, then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Sin will cause you to turn your back on God. You know, we talk about the idea that God turned his back on us, and that's another theological question I don't want to get into because that goes to Jesus on the cross. But one thing is when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, what did they do? They turned their back on God, and they try to hide from God's presence, and God is the great seeker. But we realize what is a fatal mistake is Cain turned his back on God. And when you turn your back on God, because God is the creator of all things, it leaves a God-sized hole in your heart. If I can quote Blaise Pascal, a French mathematician, God-sized. So what do you do to fill this God-sized hole in your heart? Well, it says that the Cain knew his wife, conceived and bore Enoch. Now, that's not the Enoch that was translated to heaven. This is a different Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So we understand the idea of the building of a city, an alternate way of having communion and fellowship without God. It didn't say God built the city. He built the city because he didn't want his children to be fugitives and vagabonds. He wanted them to, and so we have to understand that, it's tied in that another characteristic of the person who's turned his back on God, the line of destruction. He built a city. We get back to violence. A couple generations down, there's another Lamech. This is not the Lamech who's father of Noah. But it says, then Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada. The name of the others was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal, and Jabal was the father of those who dwelt in tents and have livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal Cain, an instructor on every craftsman in bronze and iron. So when we realize this is where technology fits into the line that leads to destruction. It is characterized by technology. Now I like what the King James puts where it says the instructor. It says artificer. An artificer, what word can you think of that means phony? Artificial. And another thing that we can realize in technology, manufacturing. That means handmade. When we realize properly that God is the creator of all things, there was not all the stuff of creation, all the matter is all because of God. The fact that we exist and are created in his image is by the gift and the creation of God. So anytime we start making stuff and take the glory from God, rather than giving God the glory that he made it possible for us to make these things. But you see here, we talk about the characterized by technology. I'm not saying technology is bad per se. I suppose the line of Seth, the other line, I would suppose they used technology, whatever the technology of that day was. But they were not characterized by technology. Technology was not their God or their means to worshiping a false god. So we go a little bit further. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, took wives to themselves of all whom they choose. The next characteristic of a generation doomed for destruction is sexual perversion. And, since we're talking about technologies, how does technology used in promoting of sexual perversion? Now, it started out in one thing. It talked about, it's the only place, the first time it's mentioned that a man had two wives. That wasn't bad. But here it talks about the sons of God sleeping with the daughters of men and producing a race of giants. Now, it's been a great mystery. I don't know exactly, what that all means, but it doesn't sound good. Who these Rephaim or whatever they are. It didn't sound like something that God really approved of. And it says, again in Genesis, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So just to summarize the characteristics of the line appointed to destruction: egregious violence, the building of cities, the use and utilization of technology, and I would say misuse or abuse, and sexual perversion. Now, if you will notice and compare this to the line of Seth, that we notice several things that talks about. First thing it talks about that it begins in chapter 5. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam in the day that God created man. He made him in the likeness of God. All of a sudden, that's not said anything about the line of Cain. It goes back to the like being made in the image of God. He created them male and female. He blessed them and called them mankind in the day they were created. And then we go a couple verses before that. It says, and as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And we read a little further. This is the other Enoch. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And after he begat Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Later in chapter 6, when he was talking about destroying the earth, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So if we're looking at what the generation, the line of Seth, who through grace and by being preserved through the line of Noah, they called upon the name of the Lord, they walked with God, and they found grace in the Lord's eyes. So I think we realize that as it was in the days of Noah. Of course, just to make brief mention of what happens after the flood, we realize they go back to city building, and they build a place called Babel. And all the people are one place and of one language, and in Babel, they decided, let us build a step pyramid to the stars, so we could worship the stars and the host of heaven. In other words, to use the technology of building pyramids so they could worship false gods. There's nothing new under the sun. And you remember Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, he cries out, is this not great Babylon that I have created? We think of ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, there's several things that ancient Rome was characterized by. The ability to make bigger cities because of the sewer system. And they made a god or goddess out of the sewer system called the Cloaca Maximus. and I'll let you translate the Latin. They called Rome the eternal city, Dea Roma. And the Roman emperor was King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That sound familiar? In other words, you see the gross idolatry. And for all the things that the Roman government made, they invented concrete, they made big structures, they made aqueducts. I'm not saying all the stuff that they made was necessarily bad, but as our brother Danny brought out, it was a pretty bad time. Rome was a pretty corrupt and evil government. And I'm just saying nothing new under the sun, but it gives us an idea of what happens when technology is separated from people who seek God, people who seek God's grace, and people who refuse to give glory for what God has helped them to create. We can talk about, there's two different ways and that come from what's called the time of the Reformation and the time of the Enlightenment. And we see in the time of the Reformation people like Luther and Calvin, and they used technology. They used the printing press. Luther had no idea that writing his Latin theses were going to be translated into German and put on broadsheets and published throughout all the country. And all of a sudden, there was a great Reformation that broke out. So technology is not by itself bad. But the same technology can be used to make pornography and to make things that dishonor God. And so when I'm talking, about the technology here, I'm talking about what happens when God is not given his glory, where technology is something that we worship, or the means to something we worship that is a false god. And we can see other people, and a lot of good things happen. We would not have a modern education system if it were not for Luther and for Calvin. They thought the people who today we ignore in our public schools, we think that, if you come from the inner city, you're too dumb to learn. If you come from the hayseed part of outer Appalachia, you're too dumb to learn. No, they taught people that were the poor and the wretched, and they taught them how to read and write, and they taught them how to read and write from God's word. And there was a transformation of society. It wasn't education. It was no longer for the elite and for the powerful. And great things happened through the Reformation. But in the Enlightenment, we started getting back to the idea of elitists. People who thinks they know everything, they ought to do your thinking. In fact, the new word for democracy is thinking is hard. So leave your brain at the door and let your government do your thinking for you. That's a frightening thought. So I want to understand, I'm not here trying to say that the use of technology is bad. Again, you cannot make a God out of technology. And I want to spend some time in the modern technology era. One of the things that will be brought up tomorrow, and I don't want to repeat, I'm sure is going to be a wonderful presentation, artificial intelligence. And the dangers of artificial intelligence and having machines do your thinking for you. And I'll leave that for tomorrow. But let's look at the idea of building technology so we can build bigger skyscrapers, bigger cities. And when we build these things, we used to talk in like America the Beautiful. We talk about our gleaming alabaster cities. Do you realize how wonderful city Detroit, Michigan once was? Baltimore was a bustling seaport. San Francisco was a place people actually wanted to go to. And I guess I'm not even New York, where my sister lives, they're all going down the tubes fast. It's because they have forgotten God. And so all the technology of buildings crumble. Anything that's man-made and not made for the glory of God crumbles. That's why you see all the 7 wonders of the ancient world, that only the one great pyramid in very damaged condition survives of the 7 great wonders of the world. Nothing man makes is permanent. Only that which is done for the glory of God and for the winning of souls, that is what is important. We can talk about violence. God hates violence. God hates violence as much today as he has always hated violence. So we got now, Satan is putting violence in the families, and mother-in-laws against daughter-in-law, and Jesus talked about all the violence even within families and family groups, and violence within the cities, and we got violence between nations. Nations will rise up against nation. And look at what technology offers. Bigger bombs, faster missiles, nuclear technology, nuclear bombs. And I agree with my brother, but God. I want to make sure before I get, I can't find, I'd like to have found something that Danny said that I disagreed with. And I would bet Danny wishes he could find something he disagreed with. But, he's true. What he's saying is true. And that's a real shame. It should never be that way. And so we look at the war technology. Do you think that, they got this war in Ukraine. And, how many Ukrainian mothers or wives or children have had to grieve the loss of their soldier? And I'm going to say the same thing probably if you're a Russian mother and your child dies in combat. War and violence is a racket. Now, if you want to read a good book, Smedley Butler wrote a book, War is a Racket, and you ought to read it. And how the billionaires make money off the misery of the poor. And, I'm not anti-war when it's necessary in self-defense. And, but it should be the last cause. And I think we should all mourn and we should all cry when war has to be resorted to. But at the same time, we realize that technology is making it so that it used to be back in the days of swords and spears, it took a long time to kill 1 million people. We can kill 6 billion people in an hour, but for God. We want to make sure we understand that. There was a man named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that wrote a song, I heard the bells on Christmas Day, they're all familiar carols play. And you get to the verse that says, well, I looked and there was no peace on earth, he said. He was writing this during the Civil War. And he comes to the resolution that even though the wrong seems off too strong, God is the ruler yet. And we can talk about industrial technology and all the pretty much we can see that industry can be used to make all kinds of pollutions and maybe there's some good things come out of industry. I'm not saying it doesn't, but how many laborers have suffered? You're working long hours with dangerous chemicals. How many people have been poisoned by the water that they drink? I mean, was it worth it for Flint, Michigan, to have to go through the water poisoning that they went through? And then you start seeing this carries out into food. Do you realize they put glyphosate and they make genetically modified organisms corn that you can pour Roundup on? And it won't kill the corn plants. And it says, it's not bad for us except it kills all the microbes in our gut. And we end up dying of cancer and other stuff. And do you think that companies that produce this stuff really care? Or they have their minds simply upon profit? When industrial technology can be wonderful when you put God first. You do things for the glory of God. When you're helping, and I'm not saying that there wasn't an intent, and maybe for some people, that maybe we could feed more people on this earth or whatever. I'm not going to be the judge. I'm just saying that technology has a very shady side to it. Now, biological technology. Now, I think we talked about COVID, talked about the COVID vaccine. And, I don't want to, we've already talked about it in some depth, but I just want to bring out the idea that biology, that they invented this virus. They propagated it amongst us. They did everything they could to make sure enough people would get it. And, and the remdesivir and other stuff actually was banned because in the Ebola experiments, it killed too many people. More people died from remdesivir than died from Ebola. So you end up in a hospital and they tell you you're going to get that. Do you understand? Danny is right. That they're out to destroy us. But God, and I hate to plagiarize too much, but Brother Jones is right. But God. I want to just bring up one other thing here. There was one other son. That son was named Abel. Now, if you follow the Hebrew name Abel comes from Havel, which means breath, vanity, nothingness. Although the same word that appears in the book of Ecclesiastes, where we have vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And we realize that here is a man, a godly man, that was murdered. He didn't have any biological descendants at all, but yet, even though he's dead, his blood still speaks. That's what the book of Hebrews says. And why do I mention Abel? Because he's a type of Christ. Someone who suffered wrongfully at the hands of wicked people. Now, he's not Christ. He points to Christ. Christ, by all magnitudes greater, that he became the victim and he suffered violence that we put on him. We all crucified him. There's a song, Ah, Holy Jesus, is a Lutheran hymn, and sung right around the time of Good Friday. And there's a wailful tone at the end of one verse where he says, I crucified thee. What a statement. He had no earthly children, yet he's the head of a new spiritual race. The problem with the line of Seth is, other than the fact that Noah found grace. Now, what it means if you find grace in the sight of God, grace is never, 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 never earned. That even Noah, even though he was a much better man than Cain, even though he was a good person, he did not get saved because he was a good person. He was saved from the flood because God's grace. And it's a points forward to God's grace that comes in Jesus Christ. You see, we could say we're the line of Seth. After all, Seth is the only line that survived. And, line of Cain disappeared in the flood, except for Noah, the entire line of Seth. And the whole line of Seth does nothing more than it points forward to the birth of a Savior, Jesus. It gets right to the point. In Cain's genealogy, he talks about wives and different children. But you'll notice that the line of Seth does not. It just goes, was the father of, lived so many years, and he died, and he died, and he died, and died. And you notice that Mot in Hebrew, Mot, and he died, and he died, and he died. But they lived long lives, but they did not have eternal life. So we have to understand that for whatever Seth is the human line to Christ. But we are the line of Christ by faith. So we are the children of Abel through Christ, that we are saved by God's grace. And so what does that mean? You mentioned, how shall we then live? I believe that's a statement from Francis Schaeffer, or a book title. How shall we then live? Well, what are we characterized by? calling upon the name of the Lord, walking with him, seeking his grace, and let me add a couple more. We also seek for a better city. A city, which the book of Hebrews says, which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Realize that God has prepared for us a city. And the spiritual line, the line that goes through Abel, that points to Christ, and through Jesus Christ, we have a hope of a better city. We don't put our hopes in that America will come up with a better bomb or a better missile or a better politician. If they did, it would only be temporary. So God has already said that there's going to be an end. He's already said there's going to be an end. He's going to return. There's going to be an end to time. And it looks closer and closer every day that we're here on this earth. So get the idea that somehow we're not going to be able to save the world that way. That we have to be out and we need to show people the grace of God in Jesus Christ. Yeah, do we use technology? If it's for the glory of God and for the kingdom. I'm thankful here for the Billy Graham Center. Thankful we have a beautiful place to meet. Yes, the sound is good, and yes, we have technology. I'm not against the use of technology, but if we use this technology, that we might better share the good news of Jesus Christ. And it says that also in Hebrews 11, we live as strangers and pilgrims here, and that's something that 1 Peter also talks about. Do you realize in this world, we in a sense suffer what Cain was supposed to suffer? We are fugitives and vagabonds to the world. We're trash to the world. Now that's a deadly mistake, because we're not trash. God has made us and remade us in his image. So don't ever get the idea. I'm saying what the world thinks, that Christians are useless eaters and that they have all the answers. They do not. We wait for the city, which has foundations again, whose builder and maker is God. We live as strangers here. And we realize that all these people that are in the roll call of faith in Hebrews 11 died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they who say such things declare plainly they seek a homeland. So when we think about the idea of a homeland, there's a song that goes, I'm kind of homesick for a country which I have never seen before. Do you realize we've never seen the city except by faith? We live by faith. We live by hope. This is not a time to be discouraged. It's a time for us to encourage one another, even the more so as we see the day appearing. Anyway, I hope I've added a few words. I came here hoping I'd come home knowing more than I did, being able to serve better than I did, and I hope that by God's grace, maybe I've added just a little bit. And yes, it was good to meet Butch Baker. I knew Ted well. And I hope he's smiling down on you, Butch, because, and I think he would be, as much as I can understand about the cloud of witnesses. We'd be glad that you're involved in this ministry. I want to say that I started out my ministry wanting to be the next Billy Graham. Well, let's put it this way. I was in Walker Hall on the floor where when it was Bob Jones University, Billy Graham was in that room. I was pastor at Charleston United Methodist Church where Billy Graham preached his first sermon. And my wife's great-grandparents are buried in Antioch Baptist Cemetery where Billy Graham preached his second sermon. And then I graduated from Knox Theological Seminary, which was at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, and his grandson was the pastor. I never thought in a million years that God would open the doors here. I thank you all for the opportunity to speak, and I'm hoping to hear some of your stories. You're my heroes. You're the ones going out every day trying to win people for Christ. You know, I can add my little piece to it. But, you know, we're all in this together. May God bless you. May the peace of God be on you. Amen.